Julian Assange, he faces up to 175 years in prison and 18 counts. They are related to the accusation of him helping or agreeing to help former U.S. Army analyst Chelsea Manning break a password, and also charges related to the Espionage Act, publishing and trying to obtain documents that have to do with Iraq, Afghanistan, military records, detainee interviews, and also thousands upon thousands of State Department cables. It's a very polarizing topic, Julian Assange, the person and the case. And it's really at the nexus of press freedom, democracy, technology, national security, and espionage. So there's a lot to cover. I'm looking forward to your questions. And I want to start with Assange's lawyer, Barry Pollack. So Barry, we talked over the weekend, and you said that there were misconceptions in his case. Can you lay out what some of those are?
Sure. So the way you introduced the case is starting by saying it's a case about Assange helping break a password. There are 103 paragraphs in the document charging Julian Assange. Exactly 3 of them, 3 out of 103 of them, have anything to do with any kind of an effort or supposed effort to break a password. And the password really has nothing to do with getting access to any classified information. Then Bradley Manning had access to all of the information that Bradley Manning leaked to WikiLeaks, and leaked hundreds of thousands of documents before there was any conversation about a password, and continued to leak afterwards, even though the government itself acknowledges that Assange provided no assistance trying to get into a password. So I think that a lot of people in the general public and a lot of people in the mainstream media, when they report this case, have really bought into this notion that what Julian Assange did was somehow different than what the New York Times does, what the Washington Post does every day, because he actively assisted Manning in gaining access to classified materials. But if you read what the government actually alleges, the government doesn't even allege that that's what happened.
Well, it alleges that he agreed to help.
It alleges that he agreed to try to help get a password, the purpose of which, according to the government, was not to gain access to any material that Bradley Manning did not already have access to, not to assist Bradley Manning in leaking anything, not to decide what Bradley Manning was going to leak. The purported purpose was to allow Bradley Manning to log in, not as Bradley Manning, but to log in as an administrator. So he would log in, get access to the same materials that he could gain access to as Bradley Manning, and did gain access to as Bradley Manning, but the idea was that this would supposedly help cover his tracks and make it more difficult to ascertain that he was the leaker. Factually, there are some problems with that government theory, but that's the government's theory. It is not the government's theory that this agreement was in order to gain access to any material that Bradley Manning didn't already have access to, wasn't already leaking, and wasn't already going to continue to leak. And according to the government, this was a conversation where Manning said, "Hey, can you help me crack a password?" Assange, according to the government, said, "I'll see what I can do," and then came back a couple days later and said, "Sorry, I can't help you." That's the hacking allegation. The other, I think, common misperception in the public about what it is that Assange is charged with is this notion that Assange just took these materials from Manning and dumped them out into the public domain, just put them on the internet with complete disregard to whether there was anything in there that could be harmful to people who are providing information to the government, for example. That is also a complete misconception. In fact, all of this material was leaked to WikiLeaks. None of it was classified top secret. Most of it was historical information. Despite that, Assange did not simply put it out on the internet. In fact, what Assange did was gather an unprecedented collection of mainstream journalists. Rather than take this scoop for himself, he pulled together the New York Times, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, and others to go through all of this material and try to redact anything that might be harmful in any way. In other words, he went through the very editorial process that mainstream journalists go through every day, and in fact enlisted mainstream journalists to help him go through that editorial process. And people could disagree with some of the editorial judgments that were made by WikiLeaks. They could disagree with some of the editorial judgments that were made by the New York Times, and they could disagree with some of the editorial judgments made by The Guardian. But what they can't say, at least they can't say truthfully, is that this stuff was just dumped out there. Where that notion comes from is that months after this curation process, this editorial process happened, months after the redacted materials were published, a journalist from The Guardian, who was part of this coalition of journalists, wrote a book about his experience breaking this story. And even, I think most of Assange's critics will allow that this was newsworthy material. And so David Ley of The Guardian wrote a book about this process. And in the book, he has a chapter that is entitled 16792A4, a 50-digit alphanumeric spread. And what that is a password to the encrypted files for one of these sets of information, the State Department cables. So what would happen is WikiLeaks would have the material, they would encrypt the file, and then they would give the encrypted file to their media partners. And then there would be a password that would unencrypt the file so the media partner would be able to gain access to the information. Well, Ley puts in his book the password for the State Department files. He was under the misperception that this was somehow a temporary password and therefore no longer had any relevance. But the reality is the password is permanent. It does not change. And there remained encrypted files on the internet with the State Department cables that were encrypted, unredacted cables. But they were encrypted. Nobody could get into them, so you couldn't see the unredacted material. But if you had the password, you could get into them. And months passed, and nobody seemed to notice that this was in the book, or at least the import of it, until an article was published in a German newspaper basically laying out what I've just laid out for you, which is that the password is in the book. And so if somebody knows what they're doing, an internet sleuth knows where to find the encrypted files on the internet, all they got to do is take the password from the book, and they're going to have access to the raw material. Assange learns of the newspaper article, and what is this individual who supposedly is dumping unredacted data out and doesn't care about the consequences do? He calls the State Department. He calls the State Department to warn them that the race is now on, and it's a matter of time before people figure out how to use this password and get to the unencrypted files, and pleads with the State Department to take whatever measures they need to take to protect anybody whose names might be revealed, not by the redacted information that WikiLeaks had published, but by people who gain access to these unredacted files. And sure enough, within 48 hours, within 72 hours, a site called Cryptome, which is a US-based site, publishes the unredacted files. And soon others start publishing the unredacted files, and it is all over the internet. After it has been published and is now in the public domain, WikiLeaks also puts it on a WikiLeaks site.